Only one story this week. A deal is agreed that after 15 long and terrible months should bring home the hostages and lead to an end to the fighting in Gaza. It's unholy. I'm Jonathan Friedland in London.
And I'm Yonit Levy in Tel Aviv. Unholy, two Jews on the news. You said only one story, Jonathan, and honestly, we are all a nation collectively holding its breath. We're talking right before noon, Israel time on Thursday. There still are last-minute hurdles and delays, but it could be, and we hope it will be, that the hostages held by Hamas for 468 days of war will start coming home. The second hostage deal, not yet signed, but announced. And you know that English is my second language, but even in my first language, I'm having a hard time finding the words to explain this emotional roller coaster that is relief and joy and apprehension and trepidation, and the knowledge that this will be very different from the first hostage deal, and that the people that are coming home have been in captivity, held by monsters for such a long time. That feeling that we all have, the fear that some of them are not coming home alive, some of them are wounded, but some of them are coming home. And I think beyond everything else, it's a moment of grace, really.
I find my own reaction, somebody asked me as soon as this news broke, oh, you must be feeling such joy. And I sort of thought about to myself, why is it I'm not yet feeling that? And that's because I'm in a state of sort of suspended animation, I think. So the first reason is I just won't let myself believe it until it's actually happened. And, you know, you and I are going back and forth about sort of there are signs it's about to, and I would just be almost superstitious. I didn't want to jinx it. So until I actually see it, I'm not going to believe it. That's part of it. And by that, I think not just the announcing of the deal, actually not even just the signing of the deal, I need to actually see those hostages coming across before I'll believe it. And I think that will feel extremely emotional to see that. But the moment I'm sort of in this state of, as I say, suspended animation. One thing that caught me by surprise was on the I think it was the BBC did a kind of split screen thing of when the deal was announced, where they showed the scene in Tel Aviv and the scene in Gaza, and both sides of the screen were celebrating joyously. And there was something about seeing that you thought, well, what is there? Is there any other event that could have both of those sides happy at the same time? And the fact that they both are happy at the same time makes you think, so they've been fighting this war for these 15 long months, and actually the people themselves just didn't want to be fighting it. That they are so happy when it becomes possible that it's over, and yet it's gone on all this time, and how to explain that. And I just felt that these are two peoples who have really been failed by their leaders, because they, if that human reaction is anything to go by, they wanted this over long ago, and it has not ended. And I think we're going to get into this, but I'm afraid part of my feeling that tempered what should have been the excitement and the joy and everything else, which I know I'm going to feel if and when we see those. See, I'm still doing it, the caveats, because I don't want to tempt anything. But when we see hostages come back, there is a degree of anger on my side. I'm going to be honest about it, because I think this deal could have been done a long, long time ago. And we've been reporting on the podcast for months and months and months about the hostage negotiators from the Israeli side saying that the deal was there, and there was foot dragging by their boss, the Israeli Prime Minister. We've been saying that he was thinking about his own political position. We had Israeli Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir wanting praise for having prevented this, delayed it for months and months and months. Now, obviously, on the Hamas side too, they could have done this much earlier. They could have released all the hostages on day one. There wouldn't have been any need for any of this. I know that. But, this nobody wanted this delay. And yet it's taken this long. And you think of the number of people, we always talk about Hirsch Goldberg-Polin because we talked to his mother a couple of times over the period. killed in August. If a deal had been done earlier, maybe he would be alive. You think of Israeli soldiers who've lost their lives. You think of potentially tens of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza who would be alive now if this had ended earlier. I think it could have ended earlier. And it's so that tempers the feat, of why is it I don't want to punch the air right now, because this is laced with a whole lot of fear and trepidation of will it happen, but also some sadness that it took so long.
I think the only thing that we Israelis should do when they start coming home is bow down and apologize that it took us so long to bring them back. And I think of Merav Leshem Gonen, Romi's mother, who will be, I hope, very soon reunited with her daughter, saying that she feels like this is a rebirth. It's a rebirth for her daughter. It is a rebirth for the families of the hostages, and in a way, perhaps also a rebirth of this nation that needs to sew itself back together and remind ourselves of what we are and who we are. And who we are is a nation that doesn't leave people behind. And I think of Ayelet Levi, who we talked to on this podcast as well, Naama's mother, who will, I hope, be reunited with her. I think of Liri Elbag's parents, Shira and Eli. I think of Eli Sharabi, who's coming back, I hope, but is coming back to reality in which his wife and his daughters were murdered. And I think of the Bibas family. I hope we finally will know what happened to them. And I think you mentioned him, of Hirsch and of Carmel and Ori and Almog and Alex and Eden, who were executed by Hamas in August, and yes, could have been home. So it is a very, very emotional thing. And it's the beginning, I hope. It's a long journey, but I hope it is the beginning of healing, of healing. That's why I called it a moment of grace. It's not going to be a moment. It's going to be excruciating weeks, but maybe we can begin to heal.
Yeah, I really hope so. And for those families, I mean, as we've been saying, this is the end of one phase. Again, maybe we need to see it, and the beginning of the recovery from this. But you said the recovery of who we are as a country. We're a country that don't leave people behind. A lot of people are left behind. We're talking now about numbers in the double digits, but not triple digits, and a whole lot of people haven't come back, and in different circumstances, and we'll find out more, obviously. And some of those that were being negotiated over we're talking not about living hostages, we're talking about bodies that will be returned. There's also two phases to this, and there will be a whole lot of families who are not included in this first phase. And what emotions did they go through every day as they wait for this 42-day phase? We're going to get into all of the details of how this works with when we speak to our guest. So there is more drawn out pain here for those families reunited and for the country itself to see that return. When God willing we see it, it's an extraordinary moment. And one of will be individual human joy, but it came at such a high price, and I cannot help but shake that feeling. This could have been done and should have been done so much earlier. When you're talking about hostages, that it's the time scale cannot be months and years as it was here. It needed to be hours and days. It still shocks me how long this went on. So we have a lot of detail to get into, and I think a lot of listeners will know exactly who we turn to in this situation.
Amos Harel is the military affairs analyst for Haaretz and the person we always turn to when we want to know what is going on. These are really busy days, Amos, so we really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us on Unholy today.
Hi, thanks for inviting me.
As we speak, the deal has been announced, not yet signed, and there are, as we could have expected, some last-minute hurdles. What are they?
Well, the Middle East being the Middle East, it could have been expected, as you said. Apparently, at least according to the statements from the Prime Minister's office in Jerusalem, Hamas has some reservations. I think this is mostly about the list, which kind of prisoners, Palestinian prisoners, would be included, mainly the more famous terrorists who are on the list, and whether Israel would have a veto, power over the release of some of them. I think most of this was agreed in advance. Now Hamas is probably feeling that it has the upper hand, that it is more urgent for Israel to satisfy President Trump's demands and go forward with the deal. I assume Hamas is trying to blackmail some kind of a last minute achievement. But also, it's worthwhile for Netanyahu. Netanyahu has been attacked from the right for giving up too much, making too many concessions to Trump and the Palestinians. It may be worthwhile for him, to put in a fight for the next few hours and so on. This is, of course, nerve-wracking, especially for the families of the Israeli hostages. So we're still awaiting a final statement about the deal, but this is not going to end the family's suffering, because there will still be a few days until the first group of hostages are released. And on top of everything else, we're walking into uncharted territory. There have been deals in the past, but this is something different. We'll probably get into the details in a moment, but we're talking of 6 weeks, release of small groups of hostages time after time, then phase 2. This whole ordeal could take months until it's finished.
Well, so let's get into exactly that detail, just in very, granular terms. If the deal moves from the announcement stage to the signed and sealed stage, spell out exactly how this unfolds.
I'm not sure I have the full details, but right now we're talking of 2 major groups of hostages. There are 98 hostages held by Hamas and perhaps by other groups in Gaza. 88 Israelis, some with dual citizenship, American, I think there's 1 Brit as well. And there are 10 other foreigners, 9 from Thailand, 1 from Nepal. Anyway, as we know, about half of these people are alive. So the first group would include 33 people to be released within 42 days. And out of these 33, and this is perhaps Israel's main achievement in the last part of the negotiations, there's going to be a larger amount of live hostages to be released. The full details have not been released, but it's supposed to be somewhere around 24, 25. So there are around 10 men under the age of 50 who are not supposed to be released in the past, but are now going to be released for so-called humanitarian reasons. Either they're very sick or have been injured on October 7th and so on. So these are the numbers, and I think, look, I may be gambling here. I don't know what the outcome would be, but I would assume that this last minute's hurdle would be passed and solved by the time this is published. And so the first phase of the deal will probably be implemented. The main issue here is what happens on phase 2, because then you have a larger group. If we quickly do the math, it's 65 people to be released. Less than half of them would be alive. And that would be a lot more problematic. Perhaps, for instance, Hamas would not be able to locate all the bodies. We don't know where some of the bodies of hostages are buried, because the people, I think I've mentioned that in our talks in the past. Some people have been buried secretly by Hamas, but the people who actually buried those bodies were killed later in Israeli bombings. So I'm not sure that everybody knows. I'm not sure that we know about everybody where it's actually buried. So this is going to be a problematic outcome. And then again, there could be major issues. We haven't delved into the details yet, but there are many serious concessions from the Israeli side, whether it's evacuating the Philadelphia corridor, which was painted as a red line just a few months ago, whether it's the Netzarim corridor, whether it's almost a full-scale evacuation of the Gaza Strip itself, the return of 1 million Palestinians to the northern Gaza Strip. All of this Israel is now supposed to give to the Palestinians, so to speak, because of President Trump's demands. Since this is the case, would Netanyahu fulfill every promise here? Would we actually see this deal fully implemented, or would Netanyahu jump on the opportunity to blame Hamas for some kind of a problem with the implementing, and then blow up the agreement once we arrive at phase two. The families of the next 65 to be released, who are extremely worried right now, they have every reason in the world to be concerned, not only to the safety of their loved ones, but also being concerned about the possibility that this wouldn't be implemented, that there will be some kind of another last-minute hurdle come February or March. It's a very complicated deal, and it's hard to bet right now whether this would be fully over the line as the president wants it.
Ninya, I mean, there's so many questions here, but one of them is that kind of line between the implementation between phase one and phase two. Netanyahu has been saying quite clearly before the deal was forged, he doesn't have any intention to end the war. That's not his intent. When you hear President Biden in his statement on Wednesday, clearly that is the American administration's attempt. Can Israel, even theoretically, hypothetically, return to a war after the first phase, or does this has a momentum that even the Israeli public won't allow this to happen because they want to see all of the hostages home?
I think the momentum is critical here, and all of those Netanyahu's statements were made BT before Trump, and the Trump effect here is massive. We've talked about that in the past. The president-elect's statements claiming that he would stop the war, that he demands the war to be stopped, and that there should be a hostage deal, which would be implemented before he returns to office. All of this was quite critical. Netanyahu could play all the games he wanted with Biden for a long time. Biden, in the end, was Israel's friend, but he was like that old uncle that you can play games with in the end. And this is what Netanyahu did for a long time. He humiliated Biden. He leaked against him. He talked about dangerous demands made by the Americans and so on. And Biden could never pull it through. He could never push Netanyahu forward all the way to a full-scale ceasefire and hostage deal. The situation with Trump, I'm not trying to romanticize Trump himself, but he's a force of nature in the end, at least in the beginning, approaching the beginning of the second term. There will be failures in the future. Right now, it's his game. He's calling the shots here. He's deciding what the outcome would be. And Netanyahu, for the time being, doesn't have any other option but to play along. This is what the Netanyahu crowd, the people who worship Netanyahu, the cult as we call them, are having a hard time grasping right now. And it's really interesting to watch. Forgive me, Yonit, for mentioning the competition, if you call them that. But Channel 14 these days, that the Israeli version of Fox meets Newsmax or whatever, they're having a crisis of identity and a crisis of belief right now, of faith, because their God, one God is Netanyahu and the other one is Trump. And there were so many promises being made at those studios that redemption is coming. I mean, everything is going to be fine. Trump would let us defeat the Palestinians. There were some leaks that we would not allow humanitarian aid into Gaza because Trump would let us do what we want. We could bomb them to hell and things would be fine. We could rebuild settlements in northern Gaza Strip. We could force the Palestinians out. We could annex settlements in the West Bank. This is not going to happen, at least for the time being. Never try to figure out where Trump is heading. But right now, all of the signs he's sending are very, very different. I'm sure Netanyahu was perfectly aware of this come October or September last year. But his followers are having a very, very hard time understanding what's happening here.
So interesting in that observation about the difference in the personalities between Biden and Trump. I mean, also obviously reinforced by the fact that one was outgoing and the other was incoming. And the outgoing president always has less clout and strength than an incoming president. But I want to drill into this thing about the timing, because we have now two versions of why this was possible now compared to before, and in a way you've just given us the background to it. But on the one hand, you have the sort of official view, and the White House spokesperson, National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby said this to Yonit on Channel 12, that, this was Hamas who had to shift. They had been foot dragging, they shifted position because their sponsor, Iran, was weaker and so on. That's one version of why this could be done now rather than in May. But the other version is the one voiced in a way by Itamar Ben-Gvir, the public security minister, saying, it was me who was vetoing this deal in the cabinet, in the coalition, saying we didn't want it. And that reinforces the view that a lot of people have been reporting for many months, based on things that the negotiators were saying, which is actually the deal was there, more or less, 8 months ago, but that it was partly because of pressure from Ben Gvir, but also for his own reasons, Netanyahu who was striking. So, in your assessment, was this deal more or less there 7, 8 months ago? And was it Hamas who wouldn't agree it? Or was it actually Prime Minister Netanyahu who wouldn't do the deal then, but is prepared to do it now?
Look, I'm not trying to avoid the question, and I will answer it, but it's complicated. It's not. Look, if we go back to October 7th, we must not forget that Hamas is the side that's responsible to all of these atrocities. That this would never have happened unless a decision was made by Yahya Sinwar and Mohammed Def, both thankfully dead since then, to storm the Gaza envelope communities and to kill and rape and mutilate everybody they could find. This is the reality of the matter. Later on, I'm not sure Hamas was perfectly willing to sign a deal, but the deal was on the table since January 24. And it was even in a more focused version, it was on the table again by May 27th. It's Netanyahu himself, in all of those statements since yesterday, who keeps mentioning May 27th. This is the Netanyahu draft, the Biden-Netanyahu agreement, if you'd like. And Netanyahu, of course, reversed his opinions over that. He made a spectacular U-turn by early July of last year, where he refused to accept the deal he already agreed to earlier on. It's true that Hamas was making all kinds of problems. And yet Netanyahu himself, this whole invention, we talked about that at the time. I think I was a guest on your podcast. The whole issue regarding Philadelphia corridor suddenly presented as the most important matter to Israeli strategic in Israeli strategic history, more important than Dimona or whatever. Suddenly it was of maximum importance. And look at what's happening recently. Puff, it's gone. Hardly anybody's mentioning that. One of Netanyahu's spokespeople is still trying to fight this. And our friend and colleague Chaim Levinson is having a very good time fighting him on Twitter, promising that all forces would be, in the end, forced to evacuate the Philadelphia corridor. It would take some time, but I'm betting on Levinson in that fight. I usually bet on Levinson. But anyway, this is the reality. This is what's going on right now. Now, since this is a different kind of Netanyahu and a different kind of Israeli leadership than we were used to in the past, all facts are temporary, and you could always use a new argument. He's hoping that we have forgotten already that Philadelphia corridor was of most importance last July. Now it's hardly even mentioned. This is the reality. These are my principles, and if you don't like them, I have others for you. This is the reality. This is what he's trying to present right now. And it's not only on that. We could see that on the Feldstein affair a few months back, where his own spokespeople tried to deny that Feldstein worked for him. There were statements, we don't know that guy. He's never worked for us. And then, since they were caught red-handed, a week later they said, oh, well, he worked for us, we love him. It's a shame what they do to him. They've forgotten about him by now. This is the new reality. These are the statements made, and they're good for 24 hours, and then you have another statement. So Netanyahu it's a different battle, and it's like Trump, like Boris Johnson, if you'd like. He doesn't care about the facts of the matter. It's no longer a part of the debate. It's us.
But just bottom line, because we do care about the facts. What you are, I think, telling us is that the deal could have been done in May the 27th or July, and we obviously Hamas had their own issues going on there. But from the Israeli point of view, Israel could have done that deal, but they've waited till now.
Yes, and I'd say something even more severe or more significant, that there were lives lost, that at least 8 hostages, 2 killed mistakenly, apparently by Israeli bombing, the 2 Bedouins, and the other 6 murdered cold-blooded by Hamas guards in Rafah in late August. All of these people could have been alive had we signed a deal in early July or in late June. And what could be even worse from an Israeli perspective, 122 soldiers, we counted, our editors in Haaretz actually counted 122 soldiers died during that period in Gaza. And that was after Rafah. Rafah was more or less occupied by the IDF by mid-June. So let's talk about July and onwards. All of this fighting that went on in areas such as Rafah, Khan Yunis, and later on the massive operation in Jabalia. This could have been, we could have been over Gaza, over with Gaza by now, and this is not the reality. And now Ben-Gvir, this is the rare time where Ben-Gvir actually speaks the truth. He's giving himself more credit than he's worth. And yet his refusal to support a deal was a massive issue for Netanyahu for a long time. And this was because Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, both of them absolutely cynical about the whole deal. They keep, I think they even have the hostage pin, the yellow pin on their jackets and so on. But they don't care about the hostages. It's about power. It's about their own ideology. And in Smotrich's case, it's about building new settlements in the northern Gaza Strip. So they refuse to make a deal. Netanyahu is always the sum of all of his fears. And the decision right now, it's a competition between his fear of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and his fear of Trump. And right now, Trump is winning, and he's forcing Netanyahu into that what Ariel Sharon used to call the corrales. He's forcing him through, and Netanyahu cannot, as far as we know right now, Netanyahu cannot turn back, although he's considering it. Later on, we'll have to see. But what's interesting to see, since this is a group of absolutely cynical politicians, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich right now are, everywhere you hear them, they talk against the deal. They warn of the implications, but they're not pulling out of the government yet. Smotrich, in fact, wants to stay. It's quite evident that he wants to stay. He likes being a finance minister. He likes making the decisions about the future of settlements in the West Bank. And so does Ben-Gvir. Ben-Gvir is having the time of his life bossing police officers around. Look, a few years ago, he was a target for the police. Now they're all groveling around him in order for him to promote them. Why should he leave office?
And they have 6 weeks for the first phase to convince their supporters.
Yeah, we'll have to see where this. We'll have to see on it how this evolves. There could be still a possibility in which the government collapses under the pressure, and Smotrich and Ben-Gvir are forced out by their own voters. But right now, they want to have it both ways. They want to preach against the deal on the one hand and vote against it, and they'll allow it to continue, at least phase one.
I want to bring us back to the main thing that Israelis are going to go through, and the main thing that the families of the hostages are going to go through, and that is the return of the hostages. I think we need to recalibrate our brains to think about the fact that this is going to be a very different hostage deal than the first. The people who are coming back have been in captivity almost 10 times as long as the people released in the first deal. We don't know. By the way, when will we know who is alive, who isn't? And we also don't know their physical state and their mental state. It's going to be a very, let's say, an emotional roller coaster, what we're going to go through in these next 6 weeks.
The complete list have not been released yet, and I think this is a part of the struggle right now between Israel and Hamas behind the scenes. When are the names going to be released? When will we know about the actual condition of every hostage? I would assume that the Israeli intelligence community knows most of the details. In some cases, it cannot release the sources of the information or cannot publish publicly that it knows. But I would assume that somewhere, somebody on the Israeli side holds a list which says which hostages are presumably dead, which are still alive, and perhaps a few cases in which we're not sure about. But I think you're absolutely right, and I think, at least while talking to the Israeli public, this is something that both of us should be doing. We should limit our expectations. This is going to be different. And you broadcasted day after day those nerve-wracking scenes of the hostages coming back last time, November 23. This is going to be different. It's not going to be a little girl, or a woman with her dog being released. These are going to be hostages who are going to see sunlight, some of them, for the first time in more than a year. I don't want to frighten anybody, but I think that the way to think of it is somewhat similar to those poor prisoners coming out of the Syrian jails right now. It's true that Syria is the world's leader in probably in sadism and torture. And yet Hamas is giving them quite a competition. And this is not going to be a nice sight to watch. It's going to be very, very emotional. But I assume that it will take some time before you actually can, host a freed hostage at your studio. It will take time until those people come out and speak. They are under an enormous trauma. And in any case, in each and every one of these cases, these are families that went through hell. And in many cases, from the families from the Gaza envelope, some of the members of those families have been slaughtered on October 7th. Look at the Sharabi family, for instance. One brother, one sibling still alive. The other died, apparently, in an Israeli mistaken strike. And then some of the members of the nuclear family have been murdered on October 7th, and we're not sure even if the brother who stayed alive in Gaza knows that. So these are huge tragedies upon tragedies, and this would remain the case. It will be a sort of a mixed bag for a long time. It's not as if we're going to celebrate in the street. It's the most emotional thing that happened to Israelis, and yet it's not all positive.
Yeah.
And not all over, actually. It's all going to be unfolding.
Yeah, it's like a sort of a Chinese torture. It's going to take a lot of time.
Just on the other side of that part of the deal, Palestinian prisoners are going to be released. How much, just on a security level, how much danger does that pose, do you think? I mean, famously, Yahya Sinwar was part of a group of prisoners who were released, and we all know what consequences that entailed. To put it sort of in shorthand, is there any sense that there is Sinwar or Sinwars in there who are going to now be released? And because it's related to then what happens in Gaza, what is the sort of, because you talk to military people all the time, what is the IDF assessment of what now happens in Gaza in terms of who's in charge, whether it's lawless and anarchy with people trying to find, their homes are in ruins and there's going to be this competition for shelter. Somebody I heard today, a Palestinian, saying there's going to be a war internally for shelter. So just who's being released and what the picture will be in Gaza from Sunday onwards.
Okay, so let's divide this into two. First of all, regarding the releases. We're talking of, I think, somewhere around 1,250 prisoners to be released. I think it's the first phase. Correct me if I'm wrong here, Yonit. Some of them are murderers, more than 200 are terrorists who are serving life sentences for killing Israelis. And you have their senior officials in Hamas and Islamic Jihad and so on, leaders of militants in jail for a long time and so on. Some of the most famous names on the list of demands are not going to be released. There's a group of 6 of very famous among Palestinians, terrorists like Abdallah Barghouti, Marwan Barghouti, who's also a politician, Ibrahim Hamid and others. These guys are not going to be released. Israel refused, and Hamas, contrary to what we may have thought, did not insist on their release as far as we know. So these guys are staying in jail. Others, somewhere between mid-level to senior leadership in Hamas in the West Bank, are going to be released, but are going to be exiled. They're not going to stay in the West Bank. They're going to be driven out by the Israelis, either to the Gaza Strip or to places like Turkey, Qatar, whoever is willing to accept them. And if we go back to the Shalit deal, at that time, I was concerned for a while because we released more than 1,000 prisoners, about 500 of them serving life sentences. And in the beginning, I said, well, it's not so bad. Okay, there were a few cases. That's not the issue. It takes time. And some of these people became important operators behind the scenes who were involved in a massive amount of attacks from the West Bank. And of course, there's a Sinwar case that you've mentioned. Sinwar himself, he was not known to many Israelis. It was Yoram Binu who interviewed him in 2006, spoke perfect Hebrew, of course, was rather young at the time. We didn't know him. We were talking of other terrorists at that time because he remained in jail since '88, since the First Intifada. And yet he was the most important person to come out of the jails at that moment. And 12 years later, look what happened. So Hamas will attempt to use those prisoners to regain control of some of its networks in the West Bank, even if it happens from sort of a standoff position. And this is important. Regarding Gaza, many of them will be pushed to Gaza, and they're not Gazans. They're coming from the West Bank, and the division is quite massive by now, because people from the West Bank have not visited Gaza for ages. These are almost two different populations. We'll have to see. Gaza, I think I'll make two observations here. One is that the chaos would remain, and there will be similarities with what we call the Somali situation in Gaza because of the destruction, because of the deaths, because of the illnesses, and so on. On the other hand, we'll see a rise in Hamas power. They're shaping the narrative already. They're telling the population in both the West Bank and Gaza and the Arab world at large that they won this through Sumud. They stayed. They haven't been defeated. There are no white flags being shown. Some of the leadership is still alive, and they're going to reclaim their responsibility to the Gaza Strip, and probably they'll be successful at that. And yet, they'll still have to live with chaos, and the only way out for them is some kind of foreign involvement, an American decision for sort of a new Marshall Plan, and some promises for resources from the Saudis and the Qataris and the Emiratis. And this is not going to happen without Hamas, I think, stepping away from power. So they will be faced with that choice, but it would happen further along. Right now, what we'll see is a combination of chaos and Hamas regaining power, and this is not going to be a nice sight to watch. On the one hand, a lot of violence, a lot of bloodshed, a lot of internal competition for resources, as you said. And on the other hand, for Israelis, these are the same guys that have slaughtered us. Netanyahu, remember, promised to destroy Hamas completely. Hasn't happened. It may have happened if we invested resources in that for the next 5 years. But he was not able to do that. And now he has to tell the public some other lie about that, which is interesting. The promises were not fulfilled. He talked about releasing the hostages. Of course, he would come up with some kind of an emotional narrative of how Sarah cared about them deeply and how he held those pictures of the hostages every night. I wrote some time ago that I doubt whether he remembers in the name of one hostage. I'm still gambling on that. I think he's so focused on his own survival that he doesn't really care emotionally about that. He pays lip service to the suffering of these people, but he's mostly focused about personal survival. On top of this, one final observation I would like to make, if you permit me. There's this old debate about what are Netanyahu's main goals here. Is it about ideology, strategy, and so on? For instance, my good friend and boss, Aluf Ben, has been claiming for a long time that this is part of a plan, that strategically Netanyahu wants the Arabs to suffer, the Palestinians to suffer through a second Nakba. This is something that has actually happened. And then they would pay a price by giving up ground. There will be territories annexed by the Israelis and new settlements being built. Right now, I may be wrong on this, but right now it seems that Netanyahu's personal survival is much more important than that, and that he's willing to sacrifice the ideology or the strategic concerns in order to stay on the good side of Trump and remain in power.
So, but I'm trying to understand everything that you're saying politically and the analysis on Netanyahu's goals. But I mean, from the security level, from a military level, he promised, for example, he said that Philadelphia corridor is critical for our existence. He said there won't be a return to the northern part of Gaza. All this will happen under the deal. Israel, as we should say, in the first stage, essentially parallel to the fact that hostages are being released, is beginning to withdraw from the Gaza Strip. Is this, it's a strange thing to ask, maybe even callous when there are human lives and hostages being released. Is this a good deal for Israel? On the military level, will it prevent Hamas from regrouping, from trying to do this again?
Maybe you should ask Netanyahu all this once he agrees to come up on your show. Look, this is not a good deal, but it's the only deal that's on the table for Israelis right now. And if we decide not to accept, then more lives would be lost. The war has no direction by now. I still support the goals of the war. I think it was the right thing to do under terrible conditions to decide on ground incursions into Gaza and so on. And yet it was quite clear in our conversations more than a year ago that you could not settle those two goals together. And time-wise, they're not synchronized. You cannot both destroy Hamas completely and bring back the hostages alive, because the hostages would not remain alive until the time where you presumably finally succeed in destroying Hamas completely. That would have taken 5 years. The hostages don't have that time. And therefore, the reality is, look, we've defeated Hamas. We haven't destroyed them completely. There's no final victory here. But most of their massive capabilities, whether it was launching a huge amount of rockets to the Tel Aviv area, whether it was sophisticated, coordinated attacks, such as those we've encountered on October 7th, the capability is no longer there. It's not the same leadership. It's not the same infrastructure. No longer the same weapons. Smuggling is going to be much harder to do, even if we reach an agreement with the Egyptians. If the Egyptians are replying to American demands, then this would not be the same kind of mess that we've encountered for many, many years on the Philadelphia corridor. So things have improved, and I think that there will be a level. Deterrence is always a risky concept. And yet there will be a level of deterrence. Would Palestinians support another war against Israel, considering what has happened to them? It will take a few decades, I think, before they dare to do that. I may be wrong on this, but this is my Western perspective, if you like, over this. So, look, we haven't won this, but let's remember where this started. This started with absolute destruction of border communities on October 7th. And remember that Hezbollah was about to join, and if Hezbollah would have joined, and we've talked about that in the past, we would have faced a huge military disaster on the northern front. This didn't happen. This didn't materialize, this danger. And I think we've recovered, we've regrouped, we've inflicted a lot of pain, some of it necessary and some of it not, on the other side. And it has been a disaster for the Palestinians. The problem is, of course, that Hamas... The Palestinians, not that we're too good at that, but the Palestinians are not very good at introspect, at self-doubt, and so on. And so they're, right now, lining up with this narrative of, yes, Sumud, we won, and so on. If you try to look at it from Jonathan's perspective, forgive me for assuming your positions, this has not been a good year for Palestinians in Gaza. This has not been the right path to take. And even if we go back and think that Hamas wanted to spoil the Saudi-Israeli deal, it may yet proceed in a short time, and it may have given the Trump administration all the reason in the world to solve this issue, and Hamas is not going to be happy about that. So again, this is another miserable draw, if you'd like. Everybody's suffering, and yet it's better than to continue the war, in my view. I may be wrong on this, but my sense is bring the hostages back, save who we can, and prevent more loss of life on both sides. And I care deeply about those soldiers who are dying now. And I'm not sure that the families are receiving good enough explanations from the army why this is happening. There's no longer a goal for the war under these circumstances. And this is, of course, after Lebanon. We've already defeated Hezbollah to some extent in Lebanon. There's already a ceasefire there. We need to end this and start recovering. And a lot of this is about the ethos. We talked about that in the past, the ethos of Israeli solidarity, of us helping one another and saving Jews in trouble. This is something that the state has failed completely its citizens on October 7th, and the government failed the hostages for the next 15 months. This has to be corrected, and the only way to begin correcting this is by releasing the hostages.
And in fact, you wrote this morning, time is necessary for one to even begin to talk about a possible rehabilitation process for Israeli society and for a recovery of the ethos we once took pride in, which is the point you've brought us to. I think we will probably have to end it there, but that is enlightening, as always. Amos Harel, thanks so much for coming on Unholy.
Thank you.
There are so many parts of that conversation that struck me, but I think what he said about, with all the fact that we need to be careful about this, but what he said about that it will feel a little bit like the Syrians coming out of the prisons after Bashar was toppled is something that is very poignant and painful about the hostages coming home, as we are glad that they are coming home, of course, and calling it a miserable draw, right? Saying this isn't total victory, but this is the deal that was on the table, and the most important thing is to bring the hostages home.
Yeah, miserable draw sounds right. I agree. It resonated, I think, for both of us when he said it. Again, though, you think the slogan from the beginning was total victory. It wasn't miserable draw. And if it was miserable
well, that's
draw,
not a slogan.
yeah, you don't put that on a bumper sticker.
Yeah.
But actually, you sort of think, well, okay, if miserable draw was the prize, we could have got that a bit earlier. You know, the whole reason it went on so long was for this promise, always illusory, said so here, of a total victory. But miserable draw is what it was. I also thought this was interesting when he talked about deterrence, and he said, you know, you would think. And then he sort of said, oh, maybe it's my Western mindset. But he said you'd think that it would be decades before Palestinians would want to risk this kind of outcome again. And I would say it's a classic case of a distinction between the people and their leaders. The people, Palestinian people, would never want to risk this kind of outcome again. And they wouldn't have wanted it, I don't believe, before, given what the consequences have been for Gaza. But Hamas, I'm not so sure they're deterred. I'm not so sure they won't think, yeah, fine, we got our issue on the agenda. So what if 50,000 of our own people died? We don't care about them. And that is, again and again, I think there is this distinction between who the actual enemy are, Hamas, and then the people who live alongside Israel, you know, millions of them, with whom Israel will have to coexist. You know, Tony Blinken did his farewell speech at the State Department this week, and he said, you know, he had some very tough language for both sides. Said, you know, still believes very much in a two-state solution, but he said, you know, Israel may have recruited as many fighters for Hamas as it killed and removed, and it is going to have to eventually reckon with this. And he said, you know, that it can't treat Palestinians as a non-people forever. I'm sure now is not the moment where people were listening or ready to hear any of that from Tony Blinken, but I thought it was pretty strong coming from him. But the point I would make about it is there's this distinction. There is Hamas, who are an evil, evil force responsible for this heinous crime on October the 7th. But then there are the people of Gaza who are coming back to homes in ruins after this ceasefire deal. And somehow an accommodation has to be made with them. And I know that they won't want to have this again, another one round of this. But their leaders may see it very differently, because Hamas may think this was, you know, pretty good outcome for them, and how tragic that is for them and for everyone involved.
It is tragic for everyone involved. We have lost so much on October 7th. I think we're not even beginning to realize how much. So to think that after that you can come out victorious is a question, I think. I think that the Israeli society couldn't even be in the post-trauma area mentally, because the trauma is not yet ended as long as hostages are still held. And when that begins to end, as we are seeing it now, hopefully, then maybe Israel can heal itself, can begin to heal. But all of those terms that were used at the beginning of total victory, I can understand some of where that's coming from. The shock of what happened was so deep that, you know, the thing that you would say is we'll win. And of course, as we heard from Amos, Hamas has been weakened to the extent that it can't do this again. And hopefully there will be a new leadership for the Palestinians in Gaza. That would be very good news for them and for us. But right now, yes, it's hard to feel that feeling of total victory, again, particularly because we have lost so much on the day itself. This is an irregular episode of Unholy for sure, but we do want to have our awards that are, of course, connected to the main story of the day. So we should probably start with our chutzpah.
Well, so many competitors for this title. I mean, I think you heard a little bit in the conversation we had with Amos about lines that were read and were sacred a few months ago suddenly were easily crossed, and Netanyahu would obviously be a contender, ready to embrace a deal that previously he said was just, absolutely unpalatable. But you could even go for Donald Trump himself announcing the deal before the White House or any of the participants. But I think Itamar Ben-Gvir edges ahead of a crowded field by going on the airwaves to boast that he had prevented this for many months, or he'd sort of fended off this danger. I mean, imagine saying to an Israeli nation that has been yearning, longing to be reunited with these hostages, well, I did my best in keeping them in captivity for many, many months, but, that was me you can thank for that, and thinking that's a good thing. He has a base of people who think, screw the hostages. We wanted this war to go on longer so that maybe we get a chance of settling Gaza. I mean, I can't get my head around the morality of that. I think it's completely immoral. But there we are. A man who is still a minister in the government, important job, Minister of Public Security, speaking that way. So a chutzpah award for Itamar Ben-Gvir, I would suggest.
We should say that 29 Israelis who were kidnapped alive were killed in captivity. Itamar Ben-Gvir also voted against the first hostage deal in December of 2023. He didn't think that Israelis, the more than 100 hostages that were released, should have been reunited with their families. So that is his view, and he is consistent in that. Let's go over to a sunnier category, and that is the Mensch award. And I think that there are many people who do deserve the credit for this deal finally being signed and for the hostages coming home. It's a long list. I would start with the Israeli negotiators, people we don't perhaps mention enough. Nitzan Alon, who's the head of the Israeli Defense Forces Hostages Unit, Ronen Bar, Dadi Barnea, head of Shin Bet and head of Mossad, respectively, who have had taken part in this negotiation. Of course, the Biden administration, Bill Burns, the head of CIA, and Brett McGurk. I don't want to sound like a very long thank yous list here, but it is that people do deserve this credit, and of course also the incoming Trump administration who has taken part in this. In trying to make this happen and not, leaving putting its hand on the helm as well of these negotiations.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to really widen this out. I mean, I think it's a good outcome like this. A lot of people can claim credit. The diplomats you've mentioned, I would add in even the envoys from Qatar and Egypt. They played a role. This very unusual situation of Team Biden and Team Trump at the talks, envoys of both in the room as if they were representing different countries, but working side by side. The pressure from Donald Trump, this remark, there will be hell to pay, as if, by the way, there hadn't already been hell paid by both Palestinians and Israelis these last 15 months. But that obviously concentrated minds. All those people involved, and some of them, like you mentioned, the Israeli negotiators and some of those other diplomats, have been plugging away at this fruitlessly for months and months and months, and now finally it is bearing fruit. And look, everyone else who has been involved in this, whether we're talking hostage families, whether we're talking grieving families, Palestinian families in Gaza, there has been so much pain that's gone, to go round, and yet somehow people have carried on and brought us to this moment. So it's a very, very wide category for this week's Mensch Award, I think.
Yeah, and next time we talk, we should say we are supposed to be over the threshold of the first group of hostages released. I think our mood will change after, hopefully, fingers crossed and toes crossed, that happens. And we will see the first group is supposed to be women, citizens. This is weird and a callous thing to wrap our minds around, that there are categories for people released, but we know that there are supposed to be
civilians
women,
and military.
Between civilians and military, between men and women and age groups, but we know that it should be women, the first group released, and that will be such a moment of relief and joy. That is supposed to be, as we speak now on Thursday, that is supposed to happen on Sunday. So perhaps, when we meet next, our mood will be a little bit more elated when we'll allow ourselves to have some joy and relief.
No, and the funny thing is, even just hearing you talk about it, I can feel myself getting a little bit prickly-eyed, as my children would say. just even thinking about it, the possibility, but I'm not allowing myself to feel it yet until we actually see it. But that is going to be a very big moment. We will talk about it all next time.
So we will say our thank yous to Michal Porat, and you and I shall meet next time.